they all use the same time. They just have slightly different classifications for what they count as moderate and vigorous. ACSM is a bit more rigorous. It's more geared towards fit people. The Department of Health and Social Security is geared to health. So 150 minutes of moderate, or 75 minutes of vigorous, or some combination thereof, is the minimum guideline for health. Anything more than that is better.
Yeah.
But what they're trying to do is get people to understand a minimum. Like if you're not doing this, then you can't expect to be heart healthy and...
My question was, because we have this table that you gave us to figure out our range or whatever, and there's very and very heavy. So I was wondering if you just want to do vigorous after very? Or?
Yes, yeah, this would count anywhere from 75, 77 up to like 98 is vigorous, yeah. So just go 75 and above it. Okay?
Non-stop. I moved back today.
So you were gone, you did a 3-day strike?
Yeah. We talked last night.
Okay, Ryan.
Yeah.
Well, I think my beach.
Maurice. Well, how is, Maurice, last semester we had, who else did we have off the basketball team in class?
These two?
Yeah,
He has rejected class.
he hasn't though. So, okay. I just need to make sure that he touches base with me.
Okay,
I'll try and remember to email him, but because I think I'm his advisor, so I'd just like to touch base with what he's up to.
alright.
Okay, thank you. Kevin.
Hey, did y'all ever get the books
Blake.
from the library? Was it you?
Me and Raheem?
Yeah, that pre
Liam.
Yeah,
Did they already come in?
yeah.
Oh.
Olivia. Right. Ooh, someone's earring. Max, yes. Oh, that's Mason, that's Mark, yes. Who am I missing? Just Keith and Lawrence, probably at work. Okay. All right, do we have any other questions that we need to answer before we move forward? This bit. No, you're okay? All right, so lactate threshold then is a term that you hear quite a lot if you're looking at sophisticated training programs. It represents really the race pace that can be maintained over time, right? And what it is physiologically is it's the point at which my blood lactates rise above resting concentration. Okay, so how hard am I working at that point? Remember that we see lactate when we are working via glycolysis without enough oxygen available for the pyruvate to be shuttled across to the mitochondria. So the pyruvate is then picking up a hydrogen ion and becoming lactic acid, changes into lactate and gets shuttled into the bloodstream. So this lactate threshold is linked to carbohydrate metabolism when there is not enough oxygen available. Okay? So for someone who is not a trained aerobic athlete, then that is going to occur somewhere around 50 to 60% of VO2 max. Right? Remember that VO2 max is a measure of intensity. For someone who is trained as an aerobic athlete or does a lot of aerobic training as part of their health and wellness or fitness program, then that's going to change to somewhere around 65 to 80%. Right? So what that means is that I can exercise at a higher intensity level before I reach the threshold and switch to using pyruvate and turning it into lactate. All right? So how hard can I train before lactate increases? If lactate is increasing, then the key here is that, remember, if I'm seeing lactate, that means I'm releasing hydrogens in glycolysis. And that means that the pH level in the cell is becoming more acidic, and the enzymes responsible for breaking down carbohydrate will be slowing down. So lactate threshold is kind of a signal for the fact that you're heading into fatigue. Right? So the more I can shift my lactate threshold up into higher intensities, the harder I can work before I start to become fatigued. Right? There's a significant correlation between an individual's lactate threshold and their capacity for endurance work. It's a really, really excellent measure of work capacity. The problem is it needs a blood draw. So it isn't one we use as an applied measure out on the track. Right? You will, though, see training programs, particularly if you are a swimmer or a runner, training programs using lactate threshold as a zone. So above lactate threshold, below lactate threshold, or at lactate threshold is quite often seen, as I say, in swimming and running. Other sports haven't kind of bought into it in quite the same way, but. So, let's look at the picture, because it's a little bit easier when we look at the picture. All right? So, my blue line is my untrained person. And I've never taken lactate samples, but apparently this is exactly what it looks like. It's a really sharp corner when you graph it. 1 minute you're below threshold, the next minute you're above threshold. There's no kind of hesitation, it just goes, all right? So, what we have is our untrained person starts to fatigue around 50% VO2 max. Remember, that's going to be a higher number. Higher, lower, different if it's percentage heart rate max. When we train, what happens is we shift that lactate threshold to the right. Okay? And now I can work at a much higher intensity level before I start to fatigue. Okay? So if I can work at a higher intensity level, then I'm able to get stronger, I'm able to get fitter. Okay. All right? The idea of lactate threshold is crucial because when we talk about VO2 max, right? VO2 max is genetically dictated, okay? So my VO2 max will go up as I start working harder, and then at some point, some workload, it's going to plateau. And that's as hard as I can do when I'm looking at VO2 max. All right? If you take someone who has not been training very hard, then this period of time, it can be about 12 weeks. Right? If it's someone who's fitter, then the period of time to increase their VO2 to its max. Right? So if I'm training in week 4, then my VO2 max would measure here. Right? And then week 6, it would go up a little bit. And then, okay? But once it reaches my potential, that's it. It doesn't go up anymore. Well, we have a very strong link between VO2 max and aerobic capacity. Right? But that's weird, because if I'm a runner or a cyclist or a swimmer, I don't stop training at the end of 12 weeks because I'm not improving anymore. I'm not getting any fitter. Right? But this is not one of the major indicators of fitness, doesn't change anymore. Okay? And that's where this starts happening. So once I've reached my genetic potential VO2 max, my fitness gains start to occur because I start to shift that lactate threshold to the right. Right? I can't just keep improving VO2 max, that doesn't happen. Question. Right. You want to be a little careful because we quite often hear that aerobic training improves VO2 max. Right? So you need to be a little bit cynical when you hear or read that information. Does it improve VO2 max? Yes, if I'm not at my potential VO2 max when I start training. Does it always improve VO2 max? No, because once I've reached my potential, that's it. Does that make sense? Okay. Then my training gains are occurring because of the shift in lactate threshold that allows me to work harder before I start fatiguing. Good? Okay. All right, so what kind of adaptations do we see in System 3? Okay? Always remember adaptations are typically positive. They're going to occur in a way that allows me to do a better job. So if I understand the system and how it works, then the adaptation should be relatively straightforward. Right? They're just things that occur in the system that if they were happening better, I would be better at aerobic work. So, the enzymes that are involved in Krebs cycle and in the electron transport chain, okay, increase in number. And we said that System 3 occurs within the mitochondria. So what you find is that athletes who train aerobically have more mitochondria per muscle cell than someone who works anaerobically. It's specific to the muscle group that's doing the work. Right? So swimmers have more mitochondria in their back, shoulders, arms, and less in their legs. Runners have more in their legs and less in their arms. Right? If I have more substrate, so more fats and carbohydrate available, then I would have more ability to break down fats and carbohydrate and make ATP. So one of the things that we see in a trained aerobic athlete is that their intramuscular glycogen stores, so the glycogen that's in the muscle, not the one in the liver, but the one in the muscle, is much higher. Okay? That also benefits some aerobic work that is towards the 3-minute end. Anaerobic work, rather. Okay? We also see slightly higher levels of triglycerides within the muscle tissue of someone who's a trained aerobic athlete, endurance athlete. Right? Usually there's not very much triglyceride in the muscle, there's a little bit, but most of it is stored in fat cells. For a trained individual, we see a little bit more right there in the muscle where it can get broken down and fed into Krebs more easily without having to be transported around the body. And then a big one is that at any given workload that isn't maximal, a trained athlete is going to use fats more than an untrained person. So on our crossover that we did last Friday, and we said that crossover is around 20 minutes, it's going to be a little bit earlier for someone who's a trained aerobic athlete because those fats have so much energy available. It benefits me to get at them a little bit quicker. Okay? It's not 20 minutes earlier. It's a little bit earlier, but I don't need much to make myself 10 minutes faster on a race. That also means then that they're switching to their fats sooner. That leaves more of their stored carbohydrate behind to do that sprint at the end of the race. So they're less likely to hit the wall that we talked about in that last few miles because they've got more glycogen left. So they're going to use their substrate more efficiently. When we look at the cardiovascular system, we'll talk about the fact that they develop more capillaries wrapped around the muscles to drop off more oxygen. That's another adaptation, but it's in a different system. It's always something that could happen within the way the system works that would benefit the performance using that system. Okay? Always think, what would make it work better? What would allow me to create more ATP in a given amount of time? That's the way you want to approach it, I think. Okay, so we've just covered this point. Lactate threshold is going to occur at a higher percentage of training intensity. Right? The reason that occurs is because I'm better able to use fats. I've got higher levels of enzymes within Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Okay, there's lots of physiological adaptations that help, that lead to that lactate threshold shifting over to the right. So we've mentioned mitochondrial density and volume, and then, as I said, once we start looking at the cardiovascular system, we'll see that there are some significant adaptations within the cardiovascular system that make aerobic work more effective and easier for us. So we'll come back to the capillaries and increased cardiac output after the first exam. All right. Questions on that little piece? Lactate threshold and adaptation. Bless you.
Thank you.
Okay. Somewhere over the last week or two, I mentioned EPOC, and I said we were going to come back to that. All right, so we're back to it now. EPOC stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. It's way easier to remember EPOC. Okay. I don't think so. And if you saw them, you would probably recognize it, to be honest with you, if you get it. That's the way I have found it works for me if I remember the short version and I don't learn the long version, but the long version still is recognizable when I come across it. But
Could you say it one more time?
yeah, it's excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Right? So it is exactly what it says, if you can remember the long title, right? Think about what happens when you finish exercising, right? So when you're exercising, you start breathing more. You stop exercising, does your breathing rate go straight back to normal? Never, right? Never. So it is exactly that. The fact that when we stop exercising, theoretically, if I'm no longer moving, I don't need to make ATP to fuel muscle contraction. So I don't need piles of oxygen to pick up the hydrogen at the end of the electron transport chain so that I can make tons of ATP, right? It's kind of a domino effect. And yet, even though I don't need to make all that ATP for muscle contraction, I'm still going, right? And I'm breathing in all this oxygen, well, the only reason I'm breathing in all that oxygen is to pick up hydrogen so I can make ATP. But I'm not moving anymore. So what the hell is going on, right? So, this is what is going on here, right? When we are at rest, this dotted line at the bottom here is, so on the y-axis you have oxygen consumption, right? How much oxygen I'm using. So this dotted line is how much oxygen I need to not do anything, all right? When I begin my exercise session, I need an immediate boost of ATP. But you know that it takes 3 minutes to get to system 3, where I'm using oxygen to make ATP. Right? So actually I needed this much oxygen as soon as I started exercising. But it takes me 3 minutes to get there. Right? With me so far. So here, I'm making my ATP by using system 1 and system 2. Right? I get to my 3 minutes, And now I've got the right amount of oxygen available for the work that I'm doing. Okay? So this area here is called the oxygen deficit. Right? It's the area on the graph that represents the amount of oxygen we needed to work that hard that we didn't have available. Right? And so we used system 1 and system 2. Okay? Then we kick into system 3. Then we stop exercising. But oxygen consumption, we don't stop breathing hard. So we take in all this additional oxygen here that is above our resting need. That's the key, right? This is all extra oxygen that I don't need to do no work. Two negatives in the sense that that didn't work right. There's something grammatically very bad about that sentence. When I was in undergrad, this part of the graph was the same size as this part of the graph. So this was called the oxygen deficit, this was called the oxygen debt. And what we thought, it was so simple when I was an undergrad, what we thought was, this is just breathing enough to pay back what we needed here at the beginning. Right? Now though, when you look at this, if you see it called oxygen debt, when you are researching or studying, double check your resource, because it's possible it's out of date. All right? Because typically now, this is not called the oxygen debt anymore because it doesn't match the deficit. Right? It's called EPOC, excess post-oxygen consumption. Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Blah, 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 blah. Right? With me so far? It's a little bit tricky, so I'm trying to go slow. You following? All right. So, since it's so much more oxygen than we kind of stole at the beginning, I'm doing more than paying back. Right? Because remember I said that system 3 never turns off. It's always trickling along underneath. So I was stealing some oxygen here from the blood and from the muscle to make some ATP, but it wasn't enough, and so I used the other two systems. Okay. So I have to pay back oxygen to the bloodstream, to the hemoglobin. I have to pay oxygen back to the myoglobin in the muscle cell. But that doesn't account for all this extra oxygen that I'm using. Okay. So they've divided EPOC now into two pieces. Right? The first 2 to 3 minutes is called the rapid phase. And it's steeper than the rest of the curve. Right? And what they think is that during that 2 to 3 minutes, we're resynthesizing phosphocreatine. So we need oxygen to make ATP aerobically so that I can break down the ATP, steal the energy, and put the creatine and the inorganic phosphate back together for system 1. Because I have to have system 1 ready for the next time I want to start moving. Okay? So it prioritizes rebuilding system 1. Alright? The slow phase think is going on during the slow phase is that they're using lactate, they're metabolizing lactate that was dumped into the bloodstream and storing it, right? They're dealing with the elevated hormones that occur when we're hot and when we've been exercising hard. So there's all this additional work that has to go on. My heart rate is still really high as soon as I stop exercising. So I have to do work to calm my heart rate back down. I have to bring my breathing rate back down. That all takes energy and work. And that's what they think is going on here. And I have a note to myself. Let me see if my note makes any sense here. I can't tell. Oh, on page 64. Okay. Page 64. So, there's a rather nice box on the left-hand side that gives you all the variables that they think are playing a role in EPOC. Why we have EPOC. What is that additional oxygen being used for? The figure on the right, if you like graphs and you're good at chemistry, it's to do with blood lactate levels. If not, I would ignore it because I don't want to confuse you. I want you to remember the lactate threshold graph and the EPOC graph. So I don't want you spending time on another graph unless you find it helpful. But that box on the left there gives you all, as I said, all the variables that we currently believe are feeding into this additional oxygen that we're taking in. Yes, ma'am.
Does the time of the workout, like how long you work out, does that affect how
Yeah. Intensity is more important. So the harder I work, the bigger the EPOC, but also duration. Yeah. The two are important, but intensity is more important. So if I work out for a very long time, but I'm walking around like this, then probably my EPOC is not going to be very large because I'm able to keep everything ticking over. Really, EPOC is there to get me back to resting state. Yes.
Does EPOC have like, so like if you're in really, really good shape, is someone's EPOC shorter than someone who's
It
not?
would be, yeah. That's good. Yeah. It took me forever to work this out. It was a question I used to have when I was younger, and I wasn't enough interested in XPhys to bother answering it when I was your age. And then when I started teaching it, I'm like, okay, this has to explain this. If I'm late for my office hours after class, right, and I run up the stairs over the bridge, takes me, I don't know, I'm not very fast, but just to run up the stairs, maybe 50 seconds, maybe not even that. And I get to the top of this, it's 50 seconds aerobic work. 50 seconds, right? It's not even system 2, it's still in system 1. I get to the top of the stairs and I'm going, well, how come I'm out of breath when I didn't do anything that was aerobic? Intensity. Because I broke down ATP and phosphocreatine during my 50 seconds, I have to rebuild them. So I have to breathe in to work aerobically to rebuild system 1. Took me years to work that out. Should have been a little more done, but it wasn't. It took a long time. Right? So here, I've mentioned this before, this idea of steady state. That would be considered steady state. Steady state is the point at which the amount of oxygen I am taking into the system provides the amount of ATP I need to do the work I'm doing. Right? So if I keep the treadmill at 6 miles an hour on a level, I hit my steady state quite quickly. If I turn up the incline or I speed up the treadmill, I have to start breathing harder to get in enough oxygen to create the new amount of ATP for that harder workload. Okay? Remember, we have review on Wednesday. Alright? So, if this starts sinking in and you go, what the heck was she talking about? I can go over it again on Wednesday. Alright? Okay, last slide then. Alright, so often we're in a situation, particularly if we're in a competitive sport, where the recovery phase can be crucial. So it may be that I'm in an intermittent sport like soccer or basketball, where I do something that's very hard and then I've got basically a rest period before I next have to sprint down the field. Right? Or it might be that I'm in an event where I have to come in the top 3 in my round to make the next round. And so I might only have an hour in between races before I have to race again. Okay, something like that. Or it could just be recovery between training bouts. I want to maximize my recovery so that my next training bout is as hard as it can be, and I don't have to dial down the intensity because I'm still recovering from the day before. Right? So when we talk about recovery, it's kind of a fluid term. Okay? Interval training, maximizing recovery is important. Right? So what we know is that if I want to recover so that I can run again as quickly as possible, then active recovery works very well. Okay? But I want to make it light to moderate intensity levels. So if I'm doing intervals, I might sprint really, really hard, but then my rest phase is not standing still. My rest phase is walking or jogging. Right? Less intensity than the work period, but not nothing. Right? So when we do that, that helps us to move blood lactate out, possibly metabolize it. We're learning more about metabolizing lactate. Right? So that we're ready to go again. If the goal is I want to make sure that my muscle glycogen stores are as topped up as possible, as quickly as possible, then it appears that passive recovery is more important. So that would be like overnight maybe. Okay. Sleeping is passive recovery. Right? The better my sleep, the better quality, the longer. I combine that with good nutrition, then my glycogen stores are going to be nice and high for the next day, and I can go hard again the next day. Okay? Lactate recovery doesn't appear to differ whether you're trained or untrained. That doesn't appear to happen any faster. But it happens better if I'm active than if I'm passive. So again, it depends what the goal of the recovery phase is. All right. It's all about the goal. You've got to know exactly what it is you want to achieve. And what do I need to do to maximize that achievement? Okay? I can't just go at it haphazard and go, I mean, I can, I do, right? But then I'm not bought into the outcome. Okay? But if you're working with competitive athletes, this can get very technical. Alright? So on Wednesday, we will split into teams and we'll do a little competition without, just because so many of you are competitive, it makes you study much harder when I make it a competition. It's going to be a little competition. But what I want to do before we start the kind of my version of the review for you, I want you to, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions from these 3 chapters. If you need for me to go over one of these concepts first before we start the review, come in ready to say that right at the beginning, because once we start the review questions, there won't really be time then at the end to go back and do a whole concept. All right? It's really urgent that you do not leave your studying until Wednesday afternoon. Okay? There's too much information. So start reviewing a little bit this evening, maybe do half of chapter 12. Even if what you do is look at the boxes in the textbook or go through your PowerPoint notes. Okay? If anybody needs an extension on the exam, I need to know before Friday. Don't be emailing me Friday afternoon and go, oops, I couldn't be there. Because I'll go, oops, then you've got a 0. Okay? All right.
Why do you show up so late?